Is Shadowverse Worlds Beyond the best deck constructor?
I've spent about 3 weeks playing Shadowverse Evolve Worlds Beyond to answer that question. I know 3 weeks isn't a whole lot of time to form an opinion on a TCG, but based on my experience thus far, here are my thoughts.
My focus will be specifically on the deck construction experience. But to make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as what you'll be doing with the decks you create, here's a brief overview of the game.
The objective is to deal 20 damage to your opponent before they deal 20 to you. You play units that will be able to attack your opponent, while also wiping out your opponent's units before they get a chance to attack you. Every card has a play point cost, and the amount of play points you are allotted each turn increases, allowing players to play more and stronger cards each turn as the game progresses. I'll speak first about the evolve mechanic, which is a core element of the game. After a certain number of rounds, you are able to evolve your units, giving them additional stats and allowing them to attack enemy units immediately. Later on, you can super evolve, which in addition to the benefits of evolving, also prevents your units from taking damage on your turn. While on the surface this is primarily just a tactical option during matches, many units gain additional effects when they evolve, creating some interesting decisions during deck construction. You can only use each type of evolve twice per game, and you can only evolve once per turn, meaning you have to ration your evolves. If your deck doesn't rely on any important evolve effects, units with more situational utility evolve effects become more appealing. However, if you need to conserve your evolves for certain effects, situational evolve effects are less valuable. Units' values differing based on your reliance on this mechanic add some nice variety to building various decks. This aspect is somewhat reminiscent of constructing with a colored mana base, where you have to be mindful of how straining cards in your deck will be on a particular color. And personally, I appreciate this over managing a colored mana base, given this mechanic's clarity and intuitiveness. When and what resources you will have is consistently known, so you can predictably build around it. Shadowverse splits its card pool into 7 different crafts. Aside from card limits, the only limitation in deck construction is a deck can only include cards from one craft.
I find this limits creativity. Of course, most cards in most games are intended to serve a particular role in a particular archetype, but it's always very rewarding to find alternate unique uses for cards. With every card being limited to the craft it was intended to serve, it makes it difficult to find unique functions for cards.
The only time I really felt there was space to explore many alternate combos was with neutral cards, which can be included in any deck. Understandably, most of these neutral cards have fairly basic abilities, and won't have any particularly interesting combos. But theorizing what type of deck would benefit most from something like Tablet of Tribulations, which removes old duplicates and gives you an additional draw each turn, is interesting. I understand there are advantages to limiting to one craft. It allows card designs that would be too overpowered when combined to exist in separate crafts. But as far as deck construction is concerned, it severely limits the feeling of discovering unique combos. When you can only use cards in its own craft, it basically always feels like your only option is to use cards as intended. Thankfully, each craft has at least 2 different archetypes within them. With my limited card pool, I commonly have to dip into multiple archetypes when constructing my decks, which provides many opportunities for tweaks and iterations to decks as I'm playing and assessing them, balancing whether to focus on a particular archetype, or diversifying to get aspects of what each specializes in. And based on the decks I'm playing against, this holds true regardless of your collection of cards. I commonly see decks incorporate aspects of 2 different archetypes.
With 2 of the most overarching aspects related to deck construction covered, I'll speak to the new player deck construction experience.
Shadowverse starts all players with a selection of what are called basic cards. These basic cards by themselves provide enough cards to create a deck in every craft. So regardless of what free starter decks you choose, and regardless of what you pull in your first few packs, you always will have the ability to experiment constructing decks in each of the 7 crafts. While I certainly wasn't making top-of-the-line decks, I appreciated that I had a reasonable ability to construct and experiment with a variety of different decks. I made, tested, and iterated on 6 completely different decks just with the few cards that I was provided when I started the game.
I fairly quickly made it to Ruby rank, and then I got a real taste of what the Shadowverse meta is like.
Prior to Ruby, simply making the best use of your cards, whether tempo or value-wise, seemed to be a viable path to victory. But once I was in Ruby, I realized that the only consistent way to deal damage to the opponent was through effects that they didn't even have a chance to respond to. Players using decent decks simply didn't allow units to stay on the board. The meta is built around entirely wiping your opponent's board every turn, building up to a point where you can play something that does half your opponent's life before they can even respond. Games are typically won by attacking with storm units that can attack the opponent directly on the turn they are played. Just as common examples I saw, Portal players spend the game building this mech that has 10 attack and storm. Kuan summons a unit with storm and 10 attack. Albert has storm and attacks twice on the same turn. After super evolving him, he has 6 power, allowing him to deal 12 damage directly to the opponent. While this appeared to decrease viable deck variety, on its own, I didn't see it as a huge issue for the deck construction experience. There's still interesting decisions to be made building around this win condition, and there are a few other non-storm win conditions. But what does always hold true is that a viable deck basically always needs a card specializing in dealing a burst of direct damage to the opponent. Not only are there relatively few cards that do this, they are usually legendary, reducing the chances that you'll have them without heavy investment. If you don't have the 2 to 3 cards that are win conditioned for a craft, you can't really construct anything in that craft that poses any competition against decks that do have these win conditions. I was enjoying tinkering with a couple of different versions of Runecraft decks. However, I didn't have any viable win conditioned cards in Rune at the time, so I ended up feeling like constructing in Rune just wasn't an option for me.
Speaking of the game's meta, remember how I said the meta was built around wiping your opponent's board each turn? This is another very important point as far as deck construction is concerned.
The only way to consistently take advantage of a synergy between 2 units is to play them on the same turn. You basically never will be able to take advantage of an effect a unit has over multiple turns, given you typically will start your turn with an empty board. And even if your opponent isn't able to completely wipe your board, they will likely prioritize removing a unit that may be able to give you additional value on your next turn. I found this really disappointing. There are many units in the game that say, whenever you do X, get some benefit. And in other games, I'd think, this could be a cool effect to build a deck around. But in Shadowverse, units functionally have a, on the turn you play this, attached to all of their effects, not enabling these effects to be a strategy on their own. There are some effects that make units harder to remove, however I still find these don't significantly increase a unit's ability to stick on the field. These effects prevent units from being selected as targets of effects and attacks. However, many removal effects in the game affect random or all enemies, which completely circumvents targeting. Even if these effects were effective at keeping units alive, the ability to apply these effects to units that do not innately have them is extremely limited, and from what I've seen, there is only one high-cost card that is able to apply these effects. There are cards called amulets that rarely are destroyed by opponents, and crests, which the opponent can't interact with at all, and these do provide more ability to synergize over multiple turns. However, these types of cards aren't particularly common. Most cards in the game are units.
This is getting into the design of cards, and there's a few aspects of card design that I feel are notable for Shadowverse's deck construction experience. The first is that many cards feel needlessly complex.
Look at Galmew, for example. First, she gives you a crest that gives you a card every turn when one of your units takes damage without being destroyed. This card deals 1 damage to all units. She also has an effect that deals 3 damage to an enemy unit when she takes damage and isn't destroyed. Either of these effects are unique card-defining effects that could stand on their own, so long as the rest of the card was rebalanced accordingly. Having one card with both seems unnecessary. But that's not even the entirety of her effects. She also has an ability where if you play her for 7 mana rather than 5, she gains Storm. This last effect isn't particularly card-defining. There are many cards in Dragoncraft that have Storm. Card complexity like this makes cards harder to parse when constructing a deck, making the process a little more tedious. Additionally, this complexity commonly seems to exist so that cards can support themselves entirely on their own. Galmew is a clear example of this. If she only had the effect of dealing damage to opponents when she was damaged, she would provide an interesting effect to try and take advantage of with other cards. However, the crest she gives you is one of the most effective ways of taking advantage of her effect, lessening the importance of other cards you combine her with. To top it all off, if you happen to play her later when you have more mana, she gains Storm, covering some of your deck's direct damage needs, again, removing what could otherwise be additional considerations for you to make during deck construction.
In many ways, this is related to the previous point about units not sticking on board. Unfortunately, expensive units need to combo with themselves because they're too expensive to play with other cards, and they're not going to stick around long enough to combo with any cards on other turns.
On a similar note, regardless of complexity, many strong and thus popular cards care very little about the deck they exist in. Albert is the clearest example. Being able to deal 12 unblocked damage if you've saved up a super evolution is a very powerful effect. It doesn't really matter what the rest of your deck is doing. Albert seems like an insta-include for any Swordcraft decks, due to being so good on his own. There's even a neutral card, which can be included in every deck, who removes an opposing card when played, and has Storm. Both effects are commonly worthwhile regardless of what else your deck is doing.
Now, this isn't to say that Shadowverse is just a slap-down good cards game. Decks usually do have some sort of specific game plan, but it's disappointing when the biggest plays that you can pull off in the game are just play big card. Especially when the rest of your deck doesn't really matter as far as setting up those big plays.
One last thing I'll mention on card design is that there are a fair number of oddly specific minor effects or limitations. For example, the new expansion added an archetype to Forestcraft focused around reducing enemy defense. The thing is, reducing enemy defense is virtually indistinguishable to simply just dealing damage. There's virtually no heal effects in the game, and I'm pretty sure there are no effects that prevent a unit from being dealt damage on an opponent's turn. The only situation where this distinction matters is there is a single card in the archetype that references enemies being given defense. And that effect only works on your own turn, so it's not even like it's an effect to counter enemy buffs. It's genuinely just a whole archetype with an alternate way of explaining how it deals damage, just so it can synergize with one specific card that synergizes with nothing else. There's also the limitation that evolve abilities by default only activate when you evolve by expending one of your evolution points. There are some units that evolve themselves without spending evolution points, and for these units, their evolve abilities are written differently, so they activate even though you aren't spending an evolution point. This distinction feels unnecessary and unintuitive. You'd think if an effect says evolve, do something, that effect would happen when the unit evolves, regardless of why it's evolving. But the real disappointing part about this is there are a couple of neutral units that evolve other allied units. At first I thought these could be cool cards to put in a deck with lots of other evolve effects, since I could activate multiple evolve effects off of one neutral unit's evolve. Them being neutral was particularly exciting given I could consider combos in any of the crafts. That was until I realized this would only work with units that had their evolve effects written to allow for that, which is only units that would typically evolve by themselves anyway. It feels like many effects are made more specific to prevent them from being used outside of their intended use case, which for deck construction is rather disappointing as it really hampers the ability to be creative.
After a couple weeks of experimenting with the cards that the game starts you off with, I set out to really optimize the deck.
I decided to craft a deck that took advantage of the unique properties of amulets. Despite the monocraft limitation, crafting this deck did present a reasonable amount of considerations to be made. Given the deck was based around amulets, at first I was considering all the amulet support. But I realized that the deck was quite fast, and I didn't need the top end, so that opened up some more choice in other tech to include. Amulet's value is delayed, so leaving myself open early on was a clear weakness of the deck. Addressing this weakness while still making sure I had enough amulets to gain my amulet contingent effects was something that went through a lot of testing and iteration.
Overall, the process was pretty rewarding. I feel like my efforts resulted in something that was reasonably competitive, unique, and made through my own agency, not just something the game wanted me to put together. And that's a lot better than I was expecting, considering I only spent 3 weeks on the game and didn't spend any money on it. A couple of caveats though.
As of right now, within the craft I built this deck, there weren't many needlessly complex cards. If more expansions were released, and more cards like Rodeo existed, who has 2 completely unrelated effects as well as a seemingly out-of-place discard cost, parsing through all my options would have been more cumbersome. The second, and something that needs to be stressed, this deck only has 3 legendaries in it. From what I have seen, well-made decks basically always have at least 6 legendaries, usually more. If I had pursued making a deck in a different archetype, I almost certainly would have had to make compromises in the deck due to resource limitations. I did feel a bit constrained as far as what I could test. Crafting a card I wouldn't end up using would be very costly. Preferably, I would have tested a few more variations of this deck, but I just don't have the resources to do that. I stopped testing and iterating on the deck because of resource limitations, not because I was completely content with what I had made.
But the real kicker is what now? I certainly don't have enough resources to think about optimizing another deck. If you played daily, grinding all the quests, I'd estimate that you could probably get a specific legendary you need for a deck about every week. For the least demanding decks, that's going to be 6 weeks before you can really start optimizing another deck. Of course, paying money into the game might speed this process up, but I didn't do that, so I can't speak to how much that may speed up the process.
One thing that is available as a deck construction experience, even if you don't have resources to optimize a deck, is the game's Take 2 draft mode. The name comes from the fact that you are always taking cards in bundles of 2. This feature adds some nice depth. Assessing the value of different bundles is usually a lot more interesting than individual cards. It also gives you this 2-card combo decision when choosing your craft, While I have some concerns that certain crafts are just naturally stronger in this format, assessing how well 2 cards you are offered will build towards a viable deck is a nice incentive to explore different crafts each run. It also feels like there's a bit more variety in viable win conditions in this mode. Decks are significantly less optimized, so units sticking on board is a little more common, and people consistently drawing a dedicated uninteractive win condition is less common. That said, it's also less likely that you'll be able to really focus on a specific deck strategy. So while the win conditions have more variety, decks as a whole will feel a little less distinct, primarily being things that crafts in general focus on, not specific archetypes within that craft. And my assumption is this will become even more true as the card pool is diluted with more archetypes as more expansions release. While this is a way to continue being able to construct decks while low on resources, somewhat unfortunately the mode heavily favors having prior experience with the strategy you are constructing towards. Your deck is completely made up front. You don't make any additions or swaps after playing games and getting feedback on how it's working. Additionally, likely one of the largest areas of skill expression in the mode is getting the most value out of your 2 option refreshes. To best assess whether refreshing your current options is valuable, you need to have an idea of the value of your current options in comparison to what else exists. And if you don't have experience with the craft you are building, you may not really know what else exists. Even ignoring the fact that you can't make alterations after seeing the deck in action, the lack of games you get to play with the deck, and thus lack of feedback you get on what you constructed, is really disappointing. Your run stops after 2 losses. If you have an average win rate, that being 50%, your run will stop on average after 4 games. At just 4 games, it's hard to distinguish whether the results come from what I constructed or just game-to-game variance. And if you lose your first 2 games, which will happen 25% of the time if you have a 50% win rate, the amount of data I have to assess what could have gone better is extremely low. Never seeing a particular card you drafted through an entire run is very possible. I'll also note that you do need to spend resources to play this mode. Based on what I saw, if you save your resources for this mode rather than card packs, I think you could spend most of your time playing Shadowverse in this mode, even if you don't spend money on the game. You also get a card pack for each run and refunded some of your resources based on your performance. So you will still get new cards for roughly the same amount of resources compared to buying card packs outright.
That covers the most notable aspects of Shadowverse Evolve Worlds Beyond deck construction experience.
The game integrates its unique aspects meaningfully into deck construction, and manages to provide freedom within each craft, despite its rigid class limitation. However, the meta and card design feels like it shifts the focus of the game towards individually flashy cards, rather than creative strategies a deck can be built around.
So, is Shadowverse Worlds Beyond the best deck constructor?
Here's where I rank it. This looks sort of silly since it's only the second game I have ranked, but simply put, it doesn't contest Runeterra.
If you like deck construction, and you want to share deck construction with others, you should try Sealed Monsters.
Sealed Monsters has been designed to be a roughly 1-hour deck construction board game that's easy to pick up even for players who have never touched a CCG before. Everything needed to play with 4 players is included in one box, and the deck construction happens during play. No one has to prepare anything before the game. You can try the game on Tabletop Simulator now, or in browser on screentop.gg. You can also follow the upcoming Kickstarter campaign and join playtests on the Discord. Links are in the video's description.